And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Jiggers' Place. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every other Thursday afternoon, 5 p.m. Pacific time, to have a cocktail and talk about all of the things that I don't discuss on my other three shows, what I call the things that make life worth living: relationships, great books, ideas, the parts of our lives that are not part of our professional lives. So if you saw any of my shows over the last week or so, today I'm going to be talking about a great book. It's called Ivanhoe. It's one of the great adventure tales of all time, written by one of the greatest novelists of all time, Sir Walter Scott. And in honor of Ivanhoe, ChatGPT and I created a cocktail called the Ivanhoe Elixir. So Ivanhoe is set in the 12th century, medieval times, and Elixir, evokes that time in history. And so here's what's in the Ivanhoe Elixir. First of all, there is single malt Scotch whiskey. So I'm going to be using my all-time favorite, Oban. It's a 14-year-old Scotch whiskey from the West Highlands. There's just a little story behind this. In my first professional endeavor, when I had my real estate company, I was given an assignment to go up and review some property in the Seattle area. I'd never been to Seattle before. I flew in on a Sunday, and by the time I got to my hotel, the sun was already going down, and as is often the case in Seattle, it was a fairly cold, damp night. And so I checked in my hotel and decided I would go out and treat myself for dinner, especially since my client had excoriated me just a few weeks before for eating food bought from the grocery store and that. He says, when you travel for us, you treat yourself right. So I went to this fantastic restaurant, and they had a flight of single malt Scotch whiskey. So if you can imagine, I'm in this restaurant 2 or 3 blocks from the water in Seattle on a cold, damp Sunday evening. I'm sitting at this long bar. They had these great chairs that swiveled. They were tall, and they almost wrapped you up so no one could see you, but you could see what was happening behind. It was an eating bar. And they brought me a flight of these 4 whiskeys, a 10, 12, 14, and 16-year-old single malt whiskey. And that was the first time I had Oban and fell in love with it, have loved it ever since. So Scotch whiskey for the sort of smoky, robust base. Benedictine, which is a liqueur that's sort of reminiscent of medieval times, although Benedictine was not made until the 1500s, but still Benedictine monks and all that kind of stuff. Dry vermouth, I'm going to be using Martini and Rossi. That's just to add some elegance and complexity. Lemon juice. If you got the recipe in my email, it says fresh lemon juice. I found this at Trader Joe's yesterday. This is 100% Sicilian lemon juice, organic, not from concentrate. So I thought this sounded pretty good, so I figured I'll give this a try. It's always fun to try new stuff. That's to brighten the other flavors. And then there's going to be a couple dashes of Angostura bitters. Again, it adds depth, a little bit of spice. And then as garnish, I'm going to torch a sprig of rosemary. This is reminiscent of the English forests. Okay, so I've got my shaker with the ice in it already. We're going to start out with 2 ounces of whiskey. Where's mine? There it is. Okay. Just want to make sure I'm pouring the right amount. Okay, so gonna have to be getting another bottle of Oban soon. Okay, and then I'm gonna put in a 1/2 ounce each of the Benedictine. And then the vermouth. And for those of you who watched the show before, you know I'm not one of those fancy bartenders that fling stuff around and all of that like in cocktail. Oh, oops, it was supposed to be a full ounce of Benedictine. I realized. So put another ½ ounce in. It's always easier to add more than it is to correct for having added too much. Okay, and then a half ounce of lemon juice. Just going to shake this up a little bit. Okay, and then a couple of dashes of Angostura bitters. I decided to just use the classic Angostura bitters this time. You know, sometimes I use my Bitterman's bitters, and but this time I figured we'd go with the Angostura. Okay, and we're going to cap this off, and we're going to shake it until it's well chilled. And I always mention this. It's not just a matter of shaking it for a couple of seconds to mix them. It's chilling, and not just to chill them down. It's also to let some of the ice melt to open up the various flavors. That's all part of it. You can see it's already getting nice and chilly on the outside of the shaker. Usually, 20 to 30 seconds is probably about right. In this case, Scotch is heavier than something like a vodka or a gin, so I might do it just a little bit more. Although it's freezing my hands off. Okay, well, the whole thing is frosty now. All right, so, I'm just going to use kind of a goblet and strain this in. All right, and now I've got my torch. Oops. So let's go ahead and pull that off. Leave that on there. Going to go ahead and torch the rosemary. This isn't exactly a torch. It would be better if I had a real torch, but oh yeah, it smells so good. Okay, and put this in for the garnish, and let's give it a taste. Let's see how ChatGPT did this time. Very nice, very nice. Lots of great flavors. Okay, I will see you on the other side. So here we are on the sofa. It's Thursday afternoon, evening if you're on the East Coast, heading into the end of the week. Nice time to relax. I've got my fireplace going on over here. It's not a wood burning fireplace because the chimney in my house has been too damaged from earthquakes, but it's an electric fire. It does give off heat, and I have one of my favorite things in all the world. I don't love it as much as I love my daughter.
but books. And in this case, this is Ivanhoe. This is my copy of Ivanhoe. It's part of the Easton Press collection of great books. And I'm sorry, Easton Press. If you can see this, they're beautifully illustrated. This is a picture of Sir Walter Scott, the author. And you can see the books are beautiful leather covers. The gold edging, the ribbon that's used for so you can keep your place. And let me find one of the illustrations because I'm pretty sure. Yeah, here we go. So this is okay. So here's one of the. It's beautifully illustrated. Okay, that happens to be one of the characters, Rebecca, and you can see just the print is, well, you maybe not be able to see it. It's maybe too small. The print is beautiful. It really evokes the time period. Here's another illustration of an archer. Just very, very simple but elegant drawings. So I don't know about you, but it's one thing to read a paperback or things like that. It's a whole nother thing to sit and read just a beautifully put together book. And in this case, Ivanhoe was written over 200 years ago. So, it was published anyway in 1819. I'm not exactly sure when Sir Walter Scott wrote it, but so another bit of cocktail. So, as I mentioned, the book is set in medieval England, 12th century. And if you're familiar with the tales of Robin Hood, so Ivanhoe is connected to that. And in fact, Robin of Locksley, i.e. Robin Hood, is one of the characters in the book. So is King Richard and Prince John. And indeed, like the story of Robin Hood, the plot really revolves around Prince John's attempted usurpation of the crown while King Richard is away in the Holy Land fighting the Crusades. Now, the title character, Wilfred of Ivanhoe, is a Saxon knight. And if you recall the story of King Richard and Robin Hood, King Richard is a Norman. And the story happens roughly 100 years after the Norman conquest of England, when there was still a great deal of animosity between the Normans and the Saxons. That too is part of Ivanhoe, as it is part of the legend of Robin Hood. So Robin Hood was a Norman nobleman, but he took to banditry basically in order to protect Saxon peasants who were being preyed upon and treated manifestly unjustly by Prince John. So hang on one second, let me just move that over. There we go. So lost my train of thought for a minute. I'll take another sip while we're doing this. So in the case of Ivanhoe, Wilfred of Ivanhoe is a Saxon knight, but much to his father's chagrin, he decides to follow Richard and fight the Crusades. And so as a result, Wilfred's father disinherits him and essentially treats him as if he's dead. And the story of Ivanhoe begins when Ivanhoe has returned from the Holy Land and is seeking to reconcile with his father. And it first of all is just a romping good adventure story. So if you like stories in the vein of Robert Louis Stevenson, Mark Twain, uh, um, Jack London, and the one who wrote the Jungle, Rudyard Kipling. So if you like adventure stories in that vein, I think you will really enjoy Ivanhoe. It's got knights, it's got ladies, it's got jousting, all that kind of stuff. And by the way, there's a wonderful movie that was made about Ivanhoe, I believe in the 1940s or 50s, and it's actually a pretty faithful filming of the book, and I recommend that as well. So on that level, Ivanhoe is just a wonderful book. What's interesting, though, is underneath the great story that will just suck you in and have you turning pages are some issues that Sir Walter Scott, I think, wanted to bring to his readers to get them thinking about that, to put them on their radar, without poking them in the face, in essence, as is so common today. And it's really those those sort of social comments. They're not really comments. It's the interweaving of social ideas into this wonderful story that I think puts Ivanhoe a cut above a lot of other adventure stories. So over the last 2 weekends, I've reread Treasure Island and Kidnapped, both by Robert Louis Stevenson. They are wonderful books. I read them first as a boy, and I think this is the first time I read them as an adult. They absolutely hold up. They, I basically can't put them down. And for all of that, though, they're just adventure stories. So there's no depth to them, and that's fine. By the way, I enjoy reading books just for the sake of being engulfed in the stories, and Kipling, Stevenson absolutely does that. What's amazing about Sir Walter Scott is he is able to weave into them some food for thought. And so I just want to mention some of the characters. So I've already mentioned Wilfred of Ivanhoe, the Saxon knight, is essentially the eponymous character in the book. There's King Richard the Lionheart, who was king of England at the time, Norman king. Prince John, his brother, who tries to usurp the crown. There's Lady Rowena, who is Ivanhoe's love interest, and one of the reasons he returns is because he wants to reunite with Lady Rowena and marry her. There's also 2 other characters that are very interesting, especially to me as a Jew. So there's Rebecca, who is a young Jewish woman, and her father, Isaac of York, who is a successful Jewish merchant, as was common in England. And he also lent money. That was a common profession among Jews in England. And then there's Brian de Bois Guilbert, who is a Templar knight who has also followed Richard. There's Cedric the Saxon. That's Ivanhoe's father. He's the one who has disowned Ivanhoe and has his own journey to take through the book. And then there's Robin of Locksley, Robin Hood, right? The famous nobleman turned outlaw. And then there's Matthew de Bracy, who is a Norman knight. and he's allied with Prince John. And you can see a little bit of the echoes of the Robin Hood story. I'm going up on the name of the Norman knight who Prince John chooses to try and assassinate Richard when he finds out that King Richard is back in England, although in disguise. And then there's a couple of others, Reginald Front de Boeuf and Waldemar Fitzurse. These are also allies of Prince John, very brutal, awful human beings. And so all of these characters come together in the telling of the tale of first the return of Ivanhoe and then the return of King Richard, and how the attempted usurpation by Prince John is resolved. Now, the social issues that the book addresses, which are again what I think really makes this book a cut apart. First of all, it talks about the Norman-Saxon conflict, but I would say in a more sophisticated way than Robin Hood does. So Robin Hood is very much the tale of Robin Hood is very much, rob from the rich to give to the poor kind of thing, and that's fine. Ivanhoe is really dealing with the conflict because there were Saxon knights, there was a Saxon nobility that was essentially conquered by the Normans, and yet they never wanted to acknowledge that the Normans reigned supreme in England. And so this was an ongoing social conflict in English society. And as you might imagine, there were politics, power struggles, all of these things involved in the disputes between the Normans and the Saxons. Now, part of, if you remember from the Robin Hood story, Robin Hood essentially rebukes King John for, King Richard for leaving his kingdom to go fight the Crusades, and essentially allowing the conflict between Saxons and Normans to flare up because Prince John was so harsh with the Saxons, even the Saxon nobility, and so that the issue of conflict between groups in society is one of the issues woven throughout the book. Another is anti-Semitism. So English society, even through the time of when Sir Walter Scott was alive, still had an anti-Semitic cast to it. And in fact, there were times when England was virulently anti-Semitic, and the medieval period was such a time. And yet, the way that Jews navigated in society were able to gain success, and how they looked at their duties as subjects to, in the case of Ivanhoe, King Richard, while staying true to their faith and their identity. Again, it's quite a fascinating aspect of the book. And for his part, Ivanhoe is in love with Lady Rowena, and yet Rebecca, the Jewess, female Jew, falls in love with Ivanhoe. And yet, because of the religious divide, Ivanhoe was, of course, a Christian. She's not really able to do anything about the fact that she's fallen in love with this man who is not one of her co-religionists. So I don't want to call it religious conflict in this sense, but it's how does one live in a society that has multiple religious denominations, and yet stay true to one's faith. So there's the anti-Semitism on the one hand that one sees, especially on the part of Prince John and his allies. There is the tolerance exhibited by Ivanhoe, and there's Isaac of York, sort of caught in the middle somewhat, while being concerned about what's happening with his daughter, trying to be what he considers to be a loyal English subject on the one hand, and yet staying true to his people. All of these conflicts are dealt with in the story, and I think all of us deal with conflicts. Society is not tailored for how we want to live our lives, and we have to navigate these things sometimes on a daily basis. And this is, by the way, one of the reasons why I think it's so important to read literature, not just nonfiction. History is great. I love history, of course. But I was talking to a friend of mine. I'm not going to say his name. I don't want to put him down. But he says I don't read fiction, and I think that's a mistake. We learn a lot about how to deal with personal subjects, interpersonal relationships through reading fiction, quality fiction like Ivanhoe, that demonstrates to us how these kinds of conflicts can be dealt with, and how we can relate to people, how we can speak to people, what happens if we treat people one way or another. So again, all of this is woven into the story of Ivanhoe. Another aspect is the issue of chivalry and feudalism. So feudalism was essentially what amounts to a caste system. You had serfs who were essentially slaves, because when land was sold, any serfs that were on that land were sold with it. You had the nobility, the dukes and duchesses, and the counts and the countesses, and the earls and the lords, and all that kind of stuff. And then you had the king, and so this sort of stratified society is dealt with at a time when slavery was prevalent throughout the world, but England in particular was at the forefront of coming to the conclusion that, especially the form of chattel slavery that was present in the United States, was abhorrent. And so in dealing with the issues of the serfs and the nobility, etc., I think this was a way for Sir Walter Scott to comment on the status of different levels of people, different classes of people at the time, and expose the kinds of injustices that were going on, the kinds of abhorrent practices that were going on, and get people thinking about those issues in a way that, because they were not directly connected to the issues of the day, gave them some space to perhaps reflect on how they viewed them, maybe change their minds, and then apply them to their current lives. Cheers. I'm not sure there's a better smell than rosemary, by the way. And then finally, Ivanhoe, even though it's set in medieval England, Ivanhoe deals with the role of women in society. So again, Ivanhoe was published in 1819. Not long after that, the movement for women to gain the franchise, the vote in England started, as it did in America post Civil War. And Sir Walter Scott was investigating these issues in a context, again, that allowed, I think, his readers the space to think about them without necessarily having to confront the reality of the society in which they lived, but which gave them some space to think about them, to think about these issues, to see the power of women, the nobility of women, the influence of women on not just household domestic events, but on political events, because Ivanhoe is first and foremost an adventure tale set against the political realities of the usurpation of the crown and the conflict between Norman and Saxon. And so Rebecca in particular is an absolutely pivotal character in the story, and she exercises tremendous influence on not just on her father, which wouldn't necessarily be so remarkable, because contrary to the stereotypical picture, women have always throughout Jewish history, women have always exerted an enormous amount of influence, starting with the judge Deborah that we read about in the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. But she also has an impact on Ivanhoe himself, and you know, the idea that a young woman from a religious caste that is generally looked down upon by English society, having influence on a member of the nobility, quite a novel thing. And the idea that Jews filled, and a female Jew at that, filled an important and worthwhile role in society, even in 1819, was not necessarily a particularly widely held idea in England. And so, the book can be read on a number of levels. And by the way, this is also, I think, one of the reasons why the movie is still is such a wonderful movie, because the movie does not shy away from embracing these societal issues that are part of just the overall, that are woven, and that word, I like that word, woven, into the overall story. In a way, again, that isn't, pushing them into our faces in an aggressive way, but presenting them that so that they're hard to ignore, and yet addressing them is part of the delight of being engaged in the story. So, another bit of cocktail. So I recommend to you Ivanhoe, especially on a cold winter night, with a lovely cocktail or a hot toddy, or even just a cup of tea, and something that can delight you while providing you for weeks to come food for thought. I can't think of a better thing that a book can do. And hopefully it will introduce you to literature, especially one of my great loves is 19th century literature, whether it's Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, Thomas Hardy, J.K. Chesterton, so many wonderful novelists in the 19th century who are able to combine masterful storytelling with the raising of social ideas. Dickens is brilliant at it. Whether it's Oliver or A Tale of Two Cities, Jane Austen too, who raises so many ideas about the interaction between men and women. George Eliot, who that's actually a pseudonym. George Eliot is a woman, and I don't remember her real name now that I mention it. Mill of the Floss and Daniel Deronda. Daniel Deronda is a wonderful book. Now, it is the case that the pace of 19th century literature is slow, especially in the beginning. Oftentimes there's quite a bit of exposition that you have to sort of work yourself through so that you will be familiar enough with the setting and the people for the story to unfold in a meaningful way. Now, all the authors I've mentioned up till now have been English authors, but there's American authors, Henry James. There is Russian authors right now. I'm listening to the audio book of Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, late 19th century, as I recall. So it's not just 19th century English literature that's so wonderful. They're across the board. Although I do have to admit, when it comes down to it, the English novelists of the 1800s really capture my attention. I'm close to finishing The Bostonians by Henry James. Lovely book, very well written, engaging, has all the qualities that I've mentioned in Ivanhoe. But somehow Henry James, he's not quite Charles Dickens. He's not quite Jane Austen. I will confess, Jane Austen is probably my favorite authoress of the 19th century. I've read everything available that she's written, including her Juvenilia. Cannot recommend her more highly. Her best known books, Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, are not my favorites. My favorite is Northanger Abbey, which I'm not sure why that is. It's just somehow that was the one that particularly captivated me. So I can't encourage you enough to engage in to read 19th century literature. Now, I love to sit and read a book, especially a beautiful book like Ivanhoe, or like this copy of Ivanhoe. With the Brothers Karamazov, I found a wonderful app called LibriVox, and it's absolutely free, and it's audiobooks of great books. So by the way, you can find Ivanhoe on LibriVox. I found it there. I checked that out before the show. I'll put the name of this in the show notes, but you can download the app, and you can every morning when I'm getting ready for work, shaving and all that kind of stuff, I've been listening to the Brothers Karamazov. And one of the interesting things about LibriVox, at least the one that I'm listening to, is rather than having one reader for the whole book, so far there's been 3, and it's interesting to hear different narrators give kind of their take on how the book should be read. So that's kind of fun as well. But audiobooks are a wonderful thing. They're especially when we're talking about 19th century literature, since none of it is under copyright anymore. You can find them essentially for free, and listen to them while you're driving the car, while you're getting ready in the morning or whatever. I'm not sure we ever get tired of having stories read to us. So do yourself a favor and maybe get yourself an audiobook app and have some of the great books that have ever been written read to you by people who clearly love and care about these books that have enchanted and informed people for going on 2 centuries now. So that's my message for you. Another sip. So good. So good. I have to admit, I love savory cocktails more than I like sweet ones. So I really appreciate you joining me this afternoon, this evening. I have some folks watching live. Thank you so much for joining me live. I hope you had a chance to make a cocktail and enjoy it with me. This is my last show for this week, and so I will wish you but before I do that, if you have any thoughts, comments, always, please share them in social media. All the links will be in the show notes after the episode posts on our YouTube channel. Love to hear your thoughts. If it's something you don't want to share publicly, my email address will be there as well. You can always email me. And if I have sparked an interest on your part to read a novel from the 19th century, I can't tell you how much I would love to hear about that, because that was really the reason why I did this evening's show. So I thank you very much for joining me. Wish you a wonderful evening, wonderful rest of the week and weekend. Looking forward to seeing you next week. And signing off as I always do, to my dear Marie. This is a particular because I always felt very chivalrous towards her. Marie was a belle of the South, and I would it have been a different time, I would have been very proud to don my armor and grasp my lance and have fought anyone to sustain her honor. So Marie, darling, you are and ever will be my belle. Courage at all times, my friends.